I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to the Conversation with Al McFarlane. Today is Thursday, November 10th, 2022. What a week it's been. Election week, Tuesday, and results still coming in around the country. But I'm pleased to report that, at least in Minnesota, we have the opportunity to congratulate and applaud our Attorney General, Keith Ellison, who survived a nail biter against an incumbent that was bankrolled by quote unquote dark money, out of state money, that in my view launched what I would call a modern day lynching initiative or a modern day assassination. In fact, let me show you what we're putting out as the cover caption for the upcoming edition of Insight News. I'm going to share a page, and that'll give you an idea of what we are showing and saying, and of the discussion that we want to have in our community about what happened in this election. So here it is, and interested in your feedback, what your thoughts are, if it makes sense to you like it does to me. This is the upcoming Monday edition of Insight News, and we're leading with a powerful picture of Attorney General Keith Ellison declaring Keith Ellison victorious and decrying the GOP assassination effort. And that was a difficult word to use. I mean, yes and no. It's an important word to use. It's important that we name the story, name the process, name the crime. And from my point of view as an editor, the caption, the notion, the word assassination effort fit the GOP, the white power structure, in my view, attempted a modern day lynching, an assassination of Keith Ellison. They failed. So that's kind of what's on my mind today. And hopefully my colleagues will talk about this election, other important elections in Minnesota and around the country as well. Let me bring this back down. And first of all, welcome. Well, thank you, all of you who are listening, who voted wherever you are around the country. Our vote is that important. The work of voting is not over. I think we have to keep sending energy and encouragement to places like Atlanta, where the runoff is a likelihood. And I think more than that, or as important as that, is that we sort of declare and decide that the next election, the work towards that begins today, right now. We have to start today looking at the elections that happened in 2023, not wait till 2024 to get excited, but municipal elections are taking place. There may be other ballot questions coming up next year. We need to create a bench. We need to be intentional in developing a deep, expansive bench of potential candidates. We need to be about the business of grooming interest and teams of people that are out talking politics, talking community in our various neighborhoods, and that we elevate and promote for that work, for that series of conversations, so that all of us know that the political power that we're talking about, that is ours, is topmost on our minds all the time. So with that, let me bring in my colleagues. Brenda Lyle-Gray is here. She joins me every day from the mountains of New Mexico. And brother Ndugu Yusef Mgeni is here, my colleague and friend from St. Paul, a journalist, exceptional, and an educator and a leader in community. Good afternoon, you guys. How are you both?
Good afternoon. Like your hair, Brenda.
Oh, thank you. It was a bad hair day.
No, it wasn't.
It
looks great.
was. My boss had me having a drink at 6:30 this morning.
Okay. Look like you're going out for a drink after the show.
That's okay. We're partners. We take care of each other's back, Yusef.
Well, I hope that people are not tired of talking about the election, because there is so much to uncover. I was asking Vash before we went on the air, if he had seen the red wave, because I must have totally missed it. It didn't happen, did
It
it?
didn't happen here at all.
It was
It
just
didn't
like
happen.
2016 when the pundits said no way that Trump could be elected. I think Michael Moore was the only pundit in the country who said that Trump had a likely chance of being elected president. But a lot of stuff in the weeds, a lot of stuff to uncover today.
Well, let's start, Yusef. Talk about kind of how you look at it, what things you watch. Talk about Keith Ellison, first of all, that election, and then the entire executive sweep in Minnesota. And we've got some exciting new people coming to the Senate, for example. A lot of changes, I think, for the better.
And 3 women of color here in Minnesota as well. Locally, Keith Ellison in 2018, 4 years ago, Governor Walz got 6 percentage points of the vote more than Keith did, both running, top of the ticket, statewide offices, attorney general and governor. And Keith won handily. This time around, Governor Walz got 8 percentage points more than Keith Ellison did of the total electorate who voted. And Keith won by less than 1/2 of a percentage point. And his opponent is now gloating that he won 76 of the 87 counties within the state of Minnesota, but still managed to lose despite the assassination attack ads that really did. We talked about RAGA, the Republican Attorney General's Association, spent nearly $1 million in this state with attack ads. I found it ironic that the major ones said that Keith was the criminal's choice for Attorney General, yet the criminals don't have the opportunity to vote. Okay, so they could continue. Keith could continue to be their choice, and it wouldn't make a whit of difference. But a lot of people heard, saw, listened to the ads so many times that unfortunately they believed them, and they could vote for a Democrat at the top of the ticket for governor, but couldn't bring themselves to vote for an African-American Muslim state attorney general who had prosecuted Derek Chauvin, Kim Potter, and a number of other criminals. I include them with the other criminals who were convicted by Keith Ellison. And he was accused of being a cop killer, of defunding the police, of defending cop killers who put bombs on the top of police cars. And, the list just went on and on and on. It was sheer nonsense. We will find out. I don't know if it's the Campaign Finance Board or who will be ruling on whether or not those ads violated election laws. I think the Ku Klux Klan Act, the Voting Rights Act, because they were clearly intended to intimidate voters not to vote or not to vote for that particular candidate, and had nothing to do with the issues. But locally,
one rule there, Yusef, was that the campaign regulations forbid collusion or coordination between the
candidate
PACs and the candidate campaigns. And in this case, according to the state DFL, the documents reflect that ads were ordered for the national interest group and also ordered for the campaign by the same person, a clear violation, and a violation that could lead to $3 million in fines. We'll see. But go ahead, Yusef.
In fact, Keith is going to join us shortly. But locally, the fact that the Democratic candidates took the high road was really reflected in the vote totals. Okay, because those candidates who took the high road succeeded, and we want to talk about the pundits and the polls nationally while we're waiting for Keith and Jonathan.
Well, let's bring Jonathan and Angela in and say good morning. Jonathan, how you doing? Angela, how are you? And let's just start with a quick round of impressions on Tuesday. Keith is going to be joining us in a few minutes.
Mm-hmm. Angela,
You like I got to do a Barack Obama impression? I mean, I don't know that I've got that skill level at this point.
The young one's up in Maryland. We've got one coming right behind him. That is the young Barack Obama. I am so proud of him.
Westmore, yes.
So, yeah, you can do an impression because we're going to have another one.
Third Black governor in history.
I know, and I'm thrilled about that. I think I'm really appreciative of the fact that the so-called red wave was a red trickle, and I think, you know, once again, everything is hanging in the balance on Georgia, and I'm pretty confident Brother Raphael is going to pull it off. I think everybody is in shock about the fact that that's even going to a runoff. And what I've been saying is it's really clear that shows you how much racism is still alive. But
we got to get black men out to vote,
right?
Georgia, because that was the one sore spot.
That was the issue.
Did not step up to the plate nationally. You know,
who was that yesterday, Al, that said they brought Herschel Walker from Texas and dropped him in and put $1 million behind him and said, "Boy, you say what we want you to say."
That was Trump.
Angela, jump in, Angela Rose. How are you doing? And unmute, please, because you're muted at the moment. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I think one thing that we saw on Tuesday was that the youth, Gen Z, came out to vote, and it also resulted in one of the youngest congresspersons, a Black man named Maxwell Frost, who is 25 and representing the 10th Congressional District of Florida. So, you know, although the big news in Florida, you know, of course, is that DeSantis, the incumbent, did win, as well as Marco Rubio over Val Demings.
We'll talk about how they won those 3 House seats that were redistricted.
Yeah, no, the redistricting and gerrymandering in Florida, as well as a lot of parts of the South, is going crazy. So I would say that the long history of DeSantis drew his own district lines. So this goes back to, you know, earlier this year. There's been a lot of back and forth around the districting lines that between DeSantis, the courts, and then, of course, DeSantis's opponents. And this is just what we've seen a lot of lately. I think one of the things that even if you go back to like 2012 and how gerrymandering impacted the 2012 election, we can see that like Republicans particularly, they know how to gerrymander, and they know how if you can't beat them, gerrymander them out of office, which is
Angela,
yes.
Would you explain gerrymandering to some of our younger listeners, viewers?
Yeah, no, gerrymandering is essentially you have a map of, you know, the area, the region, the United States, and then the interstate, right? So we already know you have congressional seats, you have different like House representatives, state House representatives, state Senate representatives. How those districts are drawn is something that usually it should be based off of the census. And so that's also one of the reasons why the census is so important, because census numbers and population numbers are used when they redraw the districts after the census every 10 years. And so these 2, you know, like 22, 12, 2 years are usually the years when these redrawn maps are elected upon. So you have the major election utilizing the maps redrawn after the census. And historically, gerrymandering is you politically split a community that has a political power in of itself into other districts, into 2 districts, so that the political power of the community, particularly if you're talking about the Black community in and of itself, their political power also is split. So that community as a whole cannot organize political power to elect one representative. They would have to maybe work with or organize in the suburbs next to them or in the communities next to them. They are not one whole community politically seen on the map. They have been gerrymandered, and that also causes some very strange looking districts, right? If you ever look at a map and you wonder, why is my district a little sliver here and then real fat over here? You know, that is a political motivation most of the time.
Thank you.
Yusef, jump in. You were talking about some of the other contests in Minnesota. So take a couple of minutes and walk through some of those from the governors, the auditor, Secretary of State, and some of the key legislative races as well. The
Sure.
important thing is that now we have what we call the trifecta in Minnesota, meaning the executive mansion, the executive branch, and the House and the Senate all under Democratic control. What does it mean?
Well, we have a Black female sheriff in Hennepin County. We have 3 women of color who were elected to the state Senate. We have Rena Moran scored a higher percentage of votes than any of the other commissioners in Ramsey County. She ran to replace Tony Carter, the St. Paul mayor's mother, on the Ramsey County Board of Commissioners. And as you mentioned, the Democratic Party now has the majority of seats in the Minnesota State House of Representatives, the Minnesota Senate, and in the elected governor. And Minnesota is one of only 2 states that has a bipartisan legislature, meaning 2 houses, a House of Representatives and a state Senate that are both part of they comprise the state legislature. So inroads were made across the board in terms of state government. We mentioned earlier that Keith won his election by less than a percentage point. I hope the link was forwarded to him, so we can hear from him personally. And you know, we've seen similar occurrences across the country where the election deniers did not fare as well. The people who Trump endorsed did not fare as well. There is and was chaos within not only the Republican leadership in the Senate, but in the Republican Party. And some of the polls that were conducted that we had to suffer through interviewed as few as 150 people. Mm-hmm. And they were masqueraded as national polls. The Associated Press probably did the best national polling through its newspaper partners. And let me give you an example of what they discovered. Mm-hmm. The Republicans said that their primary issue was crime. 31% of people listed crime as a priority. 31% of the people listed inflation. 27% of the people who were surveyed listed abortion rights, reproductive rights. And people tried to poo-poo that. The Republicans begged their candidates nationally not to make, reproductive rights a part of their campaign, particularly the absence of any exceptions for rape or incest or the life of the mother. So you had 31% for inflation, 27% for reproductive rights, which essentially offset one another. The second priority for the conservatives was crime, 15%. An equal percentage said that their second priority was gun violence and gun background checks. So they effectively offset the people who said that crime and carjackings and all of this other nonsense, public safety, was their secondary priority. So they picked issues on which to attack Democratic candidates, but they didn't have concrete and specific programs and proposals for how to address those issues. Mm-hmm. When you look at inflation, inflation is a global issue. We have a war in Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia control 3/4 of the wheat production on the planet, good partners with Cargill incidentally. When you look at crime and public safety are not just concerns locally and nationally, but we had a pandemic. People were enclosed. People were out of work. People were hard pressed. And, people did what they felt they needed to do in order to survive and put food on their tables and in their refrigerators. And when you look at reproductive health, a majority of Republicans and Democrats both support reproductive health services. So for the Republicans to attack reproductive health was stupid because they were attacking their own base. And when you look at inflation, when you look at all of the stimulus payments, the frontline workers, I don't know what they called the economic checks that they received, and the other things, releasing tens of millions of gallons of gas from the fuel oil from the national reserves. A week ago, the price of national gas was estimated to be 35% higher this winter than it was last winter. That figure is now down to 20% and falling as the gasoline prices are and as other indicators of the cost of living and inflation. So they picked a lot of the wrong issues. They didn't know how to approach them. This was the most expensive election cycle in history. There's more and more dark money, dirty money, attack ads, whatever you want to call it, that is not accountable. And the media outlets are basically saying, hey, if you can pay for it, we'll run it. Okay. And that is truly unfortunate because there was so much misrepresentation, so many outright lies and falsehoods where they were portraying pictures of Black candidates 4 and 5 shades darker than they literally are. They had candidates photoshopped with T-shirts that said defund the police that the candidates did not own, had never worn, and they didn't support defunding the police. I mean, just some of the trickery, I'd call it by another name, but I want to be civil, that occurred was unacceptable and inexcusable. So I think a lot of that backfired on the people who used it. And I think that the American people are intelligent enough and bright enough to be able to see who's carrying a glass lunch bucket and who's really out there working for the working class. So good news all the way around.
Let me ask you and Jonathan to weigh in on this question of diversity, particularly in St. Paul. On Tuesday, I had guests, including the publishers of the Philadelphia Tribune, the oldest consistently published Black newspaper in the country, in America, publisher or the president of the Atlanta Voice newspaper. But locally, I brought in, invited in my colleague, Waming Mua, who's publisher of Hmong Times in St. Paul. And interesting conversation because we talked about the fact that the Hmong community is in the Black community in St. Paul and in North Minneapolis, and that the Hmong community is particularly, it seems from the outside, well organized, well directed, and has been phenomenally successful in mounting candidacies that
and
have
the
moved
Somali community too.
with
I would
speed.
add.
So how does that work between our community in St. Paul and the Hmong community? Is there collaboration? Is there competition? And Angela, you could speak to the future of new voters, new markets, new people, and where culture comes into that. Jonathan, Yusef, you guys first.
Jonathan, go ahead, bro.
Well, I would say that there is both collaboration and competition. And really, I really wish we would leave aside the competition. There, a lot of times you see in different districts that are historically represented by one group, seeing that as no other group can do it, and no other group can connect, instead of working together across the racial lines to take over more than one seat or more than one place. So I think we see some of the competition is there, and what's lost is the reason for a lot of that. You know, you look at some of the really crazy comments, from Kanye, and the reason, or Ye, I'm sorry, and the fact that people don't think about how connected our communities have been and should still be. Rondo had a really strong Jewish population that worked together with the African American population. There's no reason for us to be enemies or working at cross purposes. And when one of us gets ahead, instead of being angry at that, we should be supporting that and saying, that's great. Let's go ahead and help the next group to get ahead and get together. So I think some of it is deeply rooted in how we came to this country. And that connects into the ability to organize or the ability to have been spread far apart. But you are seeing a lot more collaborations starting to come up amongst organizations who are recognizing that as BIPOC people, we have a stronger voice together than we do working separately. And if we can collaborate and recognize the issues that each of our individual communities have and still prioritize those, we have a greater chance of working across the board to ensure representation helps everybody.
Al, I would argue that the Hmong and Somali communities are in the same position that the African American community was in the 50s and 60s. New to the political process, well organized, and it began in the South and then spread northward. That if there was an African American running that was known in the community, that everybody in the community came out and supported that person. That is no longer the case. We have more Hmong in the state legislature and the city council. We have more Hmong, more Somali in the state legislature than we have African Americans. And these communities are organized. They get behind the candidates that they believe represent them. They contribute, whether it's through the Klan or through the other cultural structures, and they turn out and vote. Kamisab Hussein won the DFL endorsement for the seat held by Rena Moran. And with that endorsement is now the representative of the Summit University community in the State House. And the Hmong have been particularly successful on the east side of St. Paul, although we've had Sai Tao, we've had Dai Tao, members of the Tao clan, who represented Ward 1 on the St. Paul City Council and District 65A, I believe, in the state legislature. So these communities are new. These communities have very specific laundry lists or agendas. When Sai Tao was in the state legislature, I think he introduced 27 bills, all of which had to do with the Hmong community. Now, some of those would allow first cousins to marry one another and were very specific to that culture. But we tend to forget that the civil rights movement benefited white women primarily, but people in general, not just African Americans. And the state legislature is very unwilling to support legislation that only benefits a specific community. So if it doesn't mutually benefit multiple communities, it doesn't get a hearing, it doesn't stand a likelihood of getting passed. When I was president of the Urban Coalition, we would go in front of an all-white committee of state legislators and talk about welfare reform, food and hunger, employment, education, and other issues. And we found it necessary to point out to the representative from Owatonna how many single white women would be affected and benefit from that legislation if it passed, because the assumption was it would only help people in North and South Minneapolis, Summit University, on the east side of St. Paul. There might be a few people on the west side or the north end or Frogtown, but basically they saw it as a black bill because it was an organization that started in the African American community that was lobbying for it. And there were 12 lobbyists on the payroll when I was president. And there were many occasions where we would get a call and would be told that somebody from the Urban Coalition needed to be present for the duration of the conference committee. Otherwise, they were not going to entertain the bill because they wanted to make sure that it benefited low-income whites and communities of color. Now, the Black community benefited from those compromise or whatever you call the cross-committee House and Senate hearings, but they were not considered Black bills. They were bills that benefited low-income people, unemployed people, people seeking to buy homes, and so on and so forth. And to the people who were just elected, or to the people, the incumbents who were reelected, who represent geographic areas in which we're present, I want to issue a warning and a plea. The warning is you need to be accountable for what legislation you endorse or author or shepherd, and not just come see us 2 months before you're up for reelection. Number one, you're going to be held accountable for the legislative initiatives that you're identified with. And number two, an old adage in our community is that the first responsibility of leadership is to train your replacement. And if we get people moving from one position to another position because of ambition and leaving a vacuum behind that is filled by someone who may not necessarily be opposed to forward progress for Black people, but just may not consider that a priority, that you're going to be held accountable too. So be accountable and train your replacements. That's the first responsibility of leadership. Before you move on to some higher echelon, make sure that your butt is covered and that you've groomed young Black women and men or people who look like you and share the same political commitment that you've been held accountable for demonstrating are going to take your place. Because Karinga used to say that our children represent life after death because they carry on the work that we begin. And that should be no different for elected and appointed officials, not just who they are today, but who they've been all along and how willing they have been to train their replacements. And that's a reality that we need to come to grips with, because we tend to go with the people from office to office and abandon the offices where they were. And, it leaves us wanting in the interim. So we have to get very serious about this. We have to get Black men off the sofas and off their butts and into the polling booths, because Black women are carrying the Black community. And who was it? I think, who was it that said we can't expect to win a fight with one arm tied behind our backs? And I would say it's our strong arm, okay? Not the lesser used arm. Black women keep our skies from falling, okay?
Angela, jump in here. And I wanted you to, because you mentioned Maxwell Frost and representing several things. One,
Black Latino.
Gen Z, representing Afro-Cuban, Afro-Latino, representing this question, considering about how do we navigate protecting legacy analyses, legacy narratives, but also recognize and incorporate in the name and under the banner of progress the changes that new voices, new people, new energies bring to augment our own for shared, advancement. What do you think, Angela?
So Tufts has a really great political analysis website called circle.tufts.edu, and they have this very fantastic analysis of the 2020 election about the youth vote. And the headline they have is "Youth Prefer Democrats by a 28-point margin." And how we can see this play out is specifically in Pennsylvania Senate race, where Democrat John Fetterman won by 3% margin. The youth here is age 18 to 29, preferred Fetterman 70% to 28%. And that is, the largest group that has the strongest support for Democrats out of the age groups. So compared to, those who are 30 to 44, the support for Fetterman was 55% to 42% against. For voters over 45, they preferred the Republican candidate, Dr. Oz. So going down the line, what we need, and what we even seen in Minnesota had a 14% increase difference between youth voters who registered between 2018 and 2022. We need to keep increasing that number. Right now, it's about a third of youth are registered to vote and do vote. We need to increase that number because that is the strongest block that Democrats can get votes from. And I would agree with what was mentioned earlier about what are the issues that youth care about? What are the issues that young voters care about? Because they might not particularly feel, the inflation the same way. They might not respond to the inflation the same way as they might abortion, right? Unfortunately, in my groups, the economy is, a lot of times people will just say, well, buy the dip. Can't wait till the market crashes because then I'll be able to finally buy a house, right? They've lived under a sustained, and I can remember, the 2007, 2008 market crash. So, lived under a sustained economic turmoil, right, for the majority of our lives. So we don't react to inflation, even gas prices. I remember when I first started driving, gas prices were, in the $3.50 range, right? $3.50 a gallon. So that's when I had started driving. That was under Obama.
And let me tell you, when I started driving, gas was 17 cents a gallon.
I was getting ready to say.
But go ahead. I'm sorry.
We went to North Kansas City to get it cheaper.
So that goes to show.
You got glasses with pheasants on them and green stamps.
I know.
That goes to show.
Cigarettes were $3 a carton. Now they're 30.
I've always lived expecting the economy to be bad, for things to be expensive.
Thanks, Angela.
But it's just that's kind of the expectation that I grew up around. Whereas abortion, I grew up believing that abortion was a woman's right, and it felt very suddenly taken away from me. So, you have different expectations and understandings of the law and what seems immediate. And, just from my perspective, the abortion issue, although a lot of people said, people have forgotten about the abortion issue since Dobbs was overturned over the summer, nobody forgot. No one forgot. And even in the 6 states where abortion was a ballot question, the repro justice folks won. The folks who are fighting for the right for abortion, they are working around the clock to advocate to maintain women's rights to abortions. And that's just, that is also a big win from Tuesday, as well as the abortion, repro justice people. We're working hard to protect women's rights because this is an immediate issue that is at the forefront of a lot of people's minds.
Did January 6th have any impact, do you think, Angela?
Well, for January 6th, I think that the impact is the understanding of the anti-Trumpers. And this might be from the Republican perspective. And I would, like to hear more on it. But I mean, one first is the threats against actual, elected officials have gone up. Right. In January 6th, also, it was the woman who won her reelection in Michigan, the Michigan governor. She was. Yeah, she was. There was an attempted kidnapping of her. And so, these issues do worry me and worry a lot of people in my cohort. But it was like, I feel like it's very much was like, that's why we can't elect these pro-Trumpers, hardcore Trumpers, because they're the ones who are perpetuating this divided government. But I don't think it has the same way that it won't, I don't think it'll manifest in the same way that the Democrats might want it. I know there was a lot of money put into highly conservative Republicans by Democrats, believing if they were the Republican candidates that the Democrats would easily win. But I do think that Democrats need to focus on what we stand for, what our values are as Democrats, and inspiring folk, and then also getting a lot of these youth registered to vote and voting. And, you know, that's I think the core. I don't think the core needs to be going after and supporting and validating some of these ultra conservatives because they'll be easy to beat. I think that even bringing the Republican Party more centrist has more benefits than in the long term of our democracy. But that's just my opinion.
You have to have a candidate first.
Exactly. I mean, candidate quality. That's what Mitch McConnell said. He said candidate quality has fallen. And I would say, yeah, candidate quality has fallen when you have a bozo like Herschel Walker up there. But, you know.
I'm good with the Maryland governor, but he's just getting in. He had some real good points this morning that everyone should hear. He's impressive.
You also saw reflected in some of the losses the impact of January 6th. There were a number of the candidates who were either supportive or actually there who ended up losing their elections. And so that was something that was really good. And I appreciate what Angela was saying, because abortion is a big issue and it stayed much more centered than people thought it was. I mean, a lot of the talking pundits were saying about, oh, it was there when Roe versus Wade was overturned, but now it's not there. You saw it reflected in those votes and in how people showed out that people care of that being a basic human right. And we're going to see some action on that here in Minnesota and hopefully in other parts across the United States. And depending upon what happens, ultimately, I think it's still going to come down to Georgia. We may see stuff on a national level. So it's nerve-wracking being here again and having to deal with this. But I think this is just like the world has changed and this is the new normal instead of we're never going to get back. I think this is what elections are now, that it's going to be several days of waiting and a lot of tight races. And people will slowly begin to recognize that they don't want crazy as their representative.
Jonathan, with the trifecta in St. Paul, what should we be thinking about for resources for the Black community or the entire state? The point is that the governor's intention to fund several things in community didn't happen because he didn't have the support, in fact, had the active blocking of his economic agenda, his plan to utilize the $10 billion in surplus. And now that is no longer a problem, what should we in community be talking about, looking at, encouraging the legislature and governor to do to make sure that as that money is distributed, we get our share? You and Yusef, maybe you respond to that, and Angela, you may as well. Brenda, you've been advocating this all the time, pushing the people on the show to think about that. Jonathan, what do you think?
I think restoration and reparation, not necessarily reparations with the big R. I think there's still people are still trying to wrap their brain around that. But I think you're going to see more efforts made towards addressing the systemic racism and the issues across. You have the movement right now with Reconnect Rondo and the Rondo organizations around the land bridge. You have a lot more recognition going into the impact that systemic racism and generational trauma has on child development, on economic development. And so you're starting to see more effort and focus put on those. And so I think that's where the push a lot of times needs to be. The education component, ensuring that we are putting money into education and supporting families that are out in the community. I appreciate where Angela is talking about being from in terms of the economy's always been bad since she's been voted, and that's a lot of what our families are dealing with, is that the economy is bad all the time now. And so what do we do instead of trying the same old thing? How do we go ahead and address that? And I think it's looking at, what the nonprofit community can do, but it's also holding government accountable and saying, you have to invest money into this section of the community because that's the one that's lagging behind. You have to put dollars into creating economic, opportunity, helping to create and develop generational wealth, and helping just to make sure that people are living above poverty and not, living in squalor. So I think that's where we're putting push is.
Yusef, what do you think? And having the record number of people of color in the legislature, what difference will that make? How will that influence and help direct money towards the development needs of our community?
Well, Al, two things. First, the definition of insanity is doing the same old things and expecting different results. And we can no longer do what we did 2 or 4 or 6 or 10 years ago. Why do I say that? There's a new phenomenon called Jim Crow 2.0. And Angela talked about how the governor and the Republican legislature in Florida targeted 3 districts that were Democrat and redistricted them so that they would be more Republican than Democrat. And we lost 3 House seats that were flipped from the Democrat to the Republican side as a result of that. Look at the attack ads. Look at we talked about 400 voter suppression bills being introduced in 48 state legislatures. And so we have to work even harder than we have in the past. We have to work even smarter, and we have to communicate and lobby and support. Politicians generally are concerned about one of 2 things: what you can do to them or for them, okay? And we generally tend to go to politicians at the 11th hour when we're about to lose something that we desperately need and say, oh, please, white folks, we like you. Won't you please like us back? Okay, and they ain't having it. So we need to stay on top of these people who represent us, whether it is geographically or otherwise. Al Sharpton was fond of saying, just because they skin folks don't mean they kin folks, okay? So we need to be talking to them. We need to be emailing them. We need to be calling them. When I was president of the Urban Coalition, it was always funny because if 3 Black people showed up for a committee hearing at the state capitol, somebody called Capitol Security, okay? And within 3 minutes, they would show up and flank the back of the room because somebody suspected that a riot was going to break out because 3 Black people had showed up at a hearing. Now, these hearings take place every day, all day and all night, especially during legislative sessions. And if there ain't nobody there watching or offering testimony or supporting and encouraging the people who allege to represent us, then we have no right to criticize what comes down the pipe, okay? Because it is seldom going to be in our interest without our injecting our physical presence, our political considerations, and our demands for what's in the best interest of our community, because we can't expect that other people are going to represent our best interest without our input. So what we can expect is a direct result of what we inject, okay? What we put into the process is what we're going to get out of it. And if we sit on our sofas and watch The Voice or whatever it happens to be and hope that they're going to do something in our favor, it ain't going to happen. We need to be in communication with them. We need to call and ask to get the bills that are being introduced in the committees that interest us, whether it's public safety, criminal justice, welfare, education, whatever it happens to be. That's all public information. And if you request it, they will provide it. And if you see something draconian, you have not only an obligation, but a responsibility to get involved in that discussion and encourage them to do something that is going to be mutually beneficial. Because, you know, Mahmoud used to say, if you want to know what white kids are doing, look at what black kids were doing 10 years ago. And that's true in so many different areas. It's not just youth, okay? And so what we do that benefits our community benefits all communities. It doesn't just benefit the Black community at some other community's expense. And we need to convince policymakers that racism hurts white people too. You know, and we don't remind them of that often enough, because they assume that we complain about racism because we're the only people who are impacted by it. And the reality is that racism hurts people across the board, because racism is connected to classism, is connected to sexism, is connected to jingoism, and whether it's xenophobia, homophobia, or kick your buttophobia, you know, it's going to hurt a bunch of people.
It hurts the perpetrators as well.
Yeah.
Angela, jump in. What do you think? And, you know, I opened up with a note about the need to be intentional again. We've done this in the past, but maybe we should do it more, and that is create a bench with a public intention in a very public way, so that everybody knows that these are the pools of candidates for these opportunities for elective or appointive or whatever. What do you think, Angela?
I agree. Particularly, there's an elected bench, and then there's also this idea of elected officials advisory cabinets. So every elected official there is, whether they recognize these people publicly or not, has a cabinet of folk that they turn to. The governor has one as well. And one of the concerns, particularly when the governor had just started, was who were the Black folk in his cabinet, right? And not official cabinet, but the cabinet of advisors, right? Who are the folk who, for, you know, Rena Moran, we know Rena Moran's advisors. Like, we know Angela Connolly's, the folk that she runs with. We know, we kind of know the Black folk who are around certain elected officials, but then we don't know around others. And so building out the trusted group of advisors is important, because last year in February, or earlier this year in February, the legislative session was discussing a $9.25 billion state surplus, right? Billion, not million, $billion surplus. And where that money goes, I know there's so many young folk who look around their communities and say, I don't feel like $9.25 billion has been injected into this community. It's almost like $9.25 billion has been divested from this community. And so we need to make sure that the community is, particularly our Black community, even though we're seeing some things happen in North Minneapolis, that doesn't always translate to the Black corridors in South Minneapolis. That doesn't always, although we see the land bridge happening in Rondo, that doesn't always translate to other parts of Rondo that are still seeing devastation, right? So let's not get just too excited about new projects when the old projects still standing there skeletons, right? And our youth realize and see and recognize the need. So yeah, like having that bench ready of just preparing youth and young folk to not just take the lead in an electoral way, but also in these other factors, but are communicating to each other, so that when that next person does run and they are 25 and they have gotten to be, you know, the next mayor, the next governor, the next congressperson, they are not an arm's length away from these other community leaders, right, who have risen up just alongside them, but in different sectors. So that's one of the things I think about, particularly since Black youth vote in 2022, the Black youth vote was almost 90% in favor of the Democrats. For the Black youth that voted, right, in congressional races, and this is what they were looking at, almost 90%, 89%, almost 90% of them voted Democrat for Black youth. And that is an extraordinary block of folk that we have. And so it's so crucial that we organize that power instead of just, gatekeeping different areas of life and gatekeeping the avenues and pathways to being advisors, to being in these backdoor meetings that we know happen, backdoor rooms that we know happen, because when there's money on the table, our community is not dumb. This is what I told Governor Walz when we were talking about this in 2021, when there was again a surplus. It wasn't $9 billion, but there was $1 billion surplus in 2021. And I said to Governor Walz, I said, our community is not dumb. We can follow the dollars and cents that are invested in our community. And it just takes a lot of effort to do that. So we need to keep, particularly as young folk, we need to keep on that, because we can see and we can tell what areas are getting funding, who's getting the funding, and if they truly represent the best in our community. And then we don't stop there. We have to be in the rooms with policymakers to make sure those funds actually get to their intended destinations.
Yusef, you talked about some of the things with the Urban Coalition that involved monitoring and pushing legislation that was really targeting disenfranchised or poor people in general that didn't have a racial tag on them, but they influenced people in geographies or in conditions that included vast numbers of our people, so that they were moved forward as beneficial to the constituents, right? Our people among them. I was listening to Roland Martin a couple of nights ago during election, and he had on Reverend Barber out of North Carolina.
Sure.
And what Barber was saying that was so powerful to me was that he gave the number, but it was upwards of 3 million, maybe more than that, people that are classified as poor, who are eligible to vote, many of whom registered to vote, but do not vote. And he faulted the party, the Democratic Party in particular, but then he went deeper and faulted those of us who understand and know what organizing is about, for not being really intentional, insisting on bringing those voters, people registered, people eligible, the people pushed out because of condition, circumstance, poverty, but those are votes. And at the one hand, that's what the vote is about, is removing those conditions and barriers to their development into their best selves as citizens and as people in community. And so how do we do that? And one thing else he said that I thought was great, he reminded us that even back in the SNCC days, the Congress of Racial Equality days, when they did organizing for voter registration, those were jobs. People were paid. How do we ensure that we create paying positions to get people to organize in our interest and in our community and be paid for doing that? What are your thoughts, Yusef and Jonathan?
That's a tough one, Al. Would anybody like to guess what the percentage of poor people are that is white? 80%. Okay. But that is a smaller percentage of the white population than the percentage of African-American people who are poor. Okay. So when we talk about poor people, we're talking disproportionately about Black people within the African-American community or white people within the total community. And as president of the Urban Coalition, I had to honor the mission of that organization, which was multicultural. And trying to get money for public policy research on issues that affected poor people and people of color was like trying to pull hen's teeth. Okay, it was not a priority in the corporate or foundation giving community. There were one or two, we used to call them fairy mother funders, that used to give us money and tell us to bless it by the use we put it to. And so when we were doing welfare reform, we had to call it capacity building. Okay. When we were doing, education for Black children, we had to call it parent involvement. Okay. Because that's whose parents we were trying to get to the table. And I think there are creative ways to direct some of that funding, but it is not and has not been a priority. Black people give a larger percentage of their income to philanthropy than any other group. Okay. It's been said that rich people give to the arts, middle class people give to church, and poor people give to the IRS. Okay. But if you look at the United Way, Black people assign a higher percentage of our incomes for workplace giving campaigns than anybody else in the workforce. And what we need to do is identify candidates who support these issues and hire people. What we need to do is support organizations. See, a nonprofit organization can lobby in its own best interest. So Jonathan has one, if not the largest food shelf in our community, and he can lobby. His staff can register with the Campaign Finance Board and lobby on food and hunger issues. There are nonprofits that specialize in education who can lobby on behalf of closing the education gap within the state of Minnesota. So we need to be encouraging nonprofit organizations to lobby in our own best interest and to provide funding for people who have a track record and who know how to do that. Because we only had 2 Black lobbyists in the Minnesota State Legislature out of 800 or 900. Okay. So who had the upper hand? All right. And those 2 were outstanding, believe me. But still, that's like playing cards with 7 brothers and sisters, and you got the hand down at the far end of the table and ain't getting nothing but 2s and 3s.
Well, that's back to the initial question of cultivating the bench, right? In all areas, developing capacity, people. Listen, we're out of time. Great conversation. Thanks to all of you. We'll see you next time. I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation.
Stay safe.